They were not meant to win. In 1776, 13 small colonies stretched along the eastern edge of North America dared to challenge the greatest empire on Earth. Britain's red-coated armies, its powerful navy, and centuries of imperial legacy stood against a ragtag force of farmers, blacksmiths, and idealists. But something was different. This revolution wasn't just about land or taxes. It was about an idea that people could govern themselves, that kings were not divine, and that freedom could be written into the law of a new world. The birth of the United States was violent, uncertain, and improbable. And yet, what emerged from that rebellion would go on to change the course of global history. In just 2 centuries, a blink in the life of empires, this nation would rise from scattered settlements to the command center of the modern world. But how? What made America different? Was it luck, geography, ruthlessness, vision, all of the above? Let's go back to where it all began, not with the Declaration of Independence, but with the land itself. Unlike Europe, where borders were ancient and crowded, the North American continent was vast and rich. The land was untamed, wild, and, according to the European mindset of the 18th century, empty. Despite being home to millions of native people, America had endless forests, mighty rivers, fertile soil, and untapped resources. It had natural borders that would shape its destiny. The Atlantic to the east, the Pacific far to the west, and a series of Great Lakes and mountain ranges in between. For a young nation, this geography was both a challenge and a gift. But land alone does not make a country powerful. It needed people and ideas. The American Revolution wasn't the first rebellion in history, but it was one of the first to be built entirely on philosophy. Influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu, the Founding Fathers didn't just fight for independence, they built a blueprint for a republic. The Constitution they created in 1787 was radical for its time. A government of checks and balances, representative democracy, and protection of individual rights. It wasn't perfect, slavery still existed, and only white male property owners could vote. But it was a framework that could evolve. And evolve it did. The American experiment had begun. Within a few decades, the United States began to stretch its borders westward. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, doubling the size of the country overnight. This wasn't just a real estate deal, it was a signal to the world. America was not content with its original shape. The idea of manifest destiny took hold. Americans believed it was their divine right to expand across the continent, from sea to shining sea. Settlers, soldiers, and pioneers pushed westward, often at the expense of native tribes who had lived on the land for centuries. By 1848, after the Mexican-American War, the U.S. had gained territory that would become Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more. The country had become a continental power. But expansion brought new problems. More land meant more states. More states meant new questions. Would they allow slavery? Who would control the economy? Who truly belonged in this land of the free? As the 19th century wore on, the question of slavery tore the country apart. In 1861, the American Civil War erupted, a brutal conflict between the Northern Union and the Southern Confederacy. Over 600,000 lives were lost. Cities burned. Families divided. The United States, just 85 years after its birth, stood on the edge of collapse. But from the ashes of that war, something powerful emerged. The Union was preserved, slavery was abolished, and the federal government became stronger than ever before. President Abraham Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, reminded the world that the United States was not just a country, but an idea worth dying for. The Civil War redefined America. No longer a fragile collection of states, it became a singular, unified force with an industrial engine, a centralized army, and a sense of destiny. In the decades following the war, the United States exploded with innovation. Railroads stitched the coasts together. Factories roared in the north. Cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, and New York became symbols of steel and speed. Immigrants flooded in from Europe, Italians, Irish, Poles, Germans, all chasing the promise of work, freedom, and a better life. They filled the factories, built the skyscrapers, and added fuel to the nation's economic fire. By the dawn of the 20th century, the U.S. had one of the largest economies on Earth. But its influence was still mostly internal. It hadn't yet become the superpower we know today. That moment was coming. It would take global war, technological revolution, and moral contradictions. It would take ambition, risk, and sometimes ruthless decisions. But the stage was set. The United States was ready to step beyond its borders and change the world. The turn of the 20th century brought a new chapter to America's story. With its borders stretched from coast to coast and its economy booming, the United States was no longer just a young republic. It was an emerging power, restless and watching the world. But for much of its early life, America preferred isolation. George Washington had famously warned against foreign entanglements, and many presidents after him tried to follow that advice. But the world would not allow it. In 1917, when Europe was already in the depths of World War I, the United States entered the conflict, changing the tide of the war. It was a decisive moment. America had crossed the ocean not as a desperate ally, but as a fresh force, bringing with it industrial might, manpower, and morale. When the war ended in 1918, it was clear the United States could no longer pretend to be a bystander in global affairs. But even then, it pulled back. The 1920s saw economic growth and cultural explosion at home. Jazz, radio, skyscrapers, the birth of Hollywood. Yet, beneath the glitz was instability. The Great Depression of 1929 would crush the American dream for millions. Banks collapsed, jobs disappeared, and breadlines stretched across cities. It seemed that the American system had failed. But then came a man named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His New Deal programs redefined the role of government, putting people back to work, regulating finance, and instilling hope in a desperate population. Still, it was not policy alone that lifted America from its knees. It was war. In 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States entered World War II. It became the arsenal of democracy, producing more tanks, planes, ships, and weapons than any other nation. American soldiers landed on beaches from Normandy to the Pacific, and when the war ended in 1945, it was the American flag that flew over the rubble of fascism. But something even more powerful had happened. The United States had developed the atomic bomb and used it twice. Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed not only Japan, but the future of warfare forever. In that moment, America became more than a victor. It became a superpower. The war left Europe in ruins. The old empires, Britain, France, Germany, were weakened. The Soviet Union had emerged as a rival, but it was battered and wary. The world, it seemed, had a new leader, but leadership came with responsibilities. America poured billions into rebuilding Europe through the Marshall Plan. It founded the United Nations, created NATO. It took on the role of global police, ready to fight not just armies, but ideologies. Thus began the Cold War. For nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union would circle each other like two titans, never clashing directly, but always threatening. Proxy wars erupted in Korea, Vietnam, and later Afghanistan. In these battles, America's role was no longer just survival, it was containment. Stop the spread of communism. Protect democracy even at a cost. Sometimes that cost was measured in credibility, sometimes in blood. Vietnam in particular stained America's image. The war dragged on for years. Thousands of lives were lost. Protests shook American streets. For a moment, it seemed the myth of invincibility had cracked. But even as it struggled abroad, America surged ahead in other arenas. The space race saw men on the moon. American companies exploded with innovation, computers, medicine, agriculture, defense. The dollar became the currency of the world. Hollywood exported not just movies, but dreams. And then, in 1991, the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Berlin Wall fell, and America stood alone. For the first time in history, one nation held economic, military, technological, and cultural dominance on a scale never seen before. It controlled the sea, the air, and even the digital frontier. But what would it do with that power? The 1990s were a time of confidence. The internet was born. Global trade flourished. American culture became global culture. Fast food, jeans, pop music, blockbuster films. But challenges loomed. The attacks of September 11, 2001 shattered the illusion of safety. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the American mainland was under assault. In response, the United States launched the War on Terror, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that would stretch on for decades. Again, questions were asked. What is America's role? Liberator? Empire? Defender? Intruder? At home, divisions deepened. Politics became tribal. Inequality grew. Social unrest bubbled. Yet through every crisis, economic crashes, terrorist attacks, pandemics, America did not collapse. It adapted. It fought. It argued with itself. But it endured. Because perhaps that is America's greatest strength. Not perfection, but resilience. Not unity, but constant reinvention. A nation that is never finished, always becoming. From 13 colonies to 50 states. From wood cabins to moon landings. From isolation to global command. The journey was never smooth. It was filled with contradictions. Freedom built on slavery, democracy built on conquest, wealth built on struggle. And yet, it became what no other nation had. A superpower shaped not by bloodlines or conquest alone, but by an idea. That ordinary people could build something extraordinary. That the experiment was worth continuing. That the dream, however flawed, still mattered. And now, standing at the edge of a new century, the question is no longer how America rose. It is how it will remain. The 21st century arrived not with a roar, but with a pulse of uncertainty. Technology accelerated. The world became smaller, faster, more connected. And though the United States had emerged from the Cold War as the lone superpower, the nature of power itself had begun to change. No longer measured only in tanks or missiles, power now hid in fiber optic cables, in satellites, in algorithms, in data. And America once again was forced to adapt. The early decades were marked by war and weariness. The invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq tested not only military strength, but public will. Trillions were spent. Thousands of lives were lost. The justifications blurred. Trust in institutions began to fray. Still, the American economy rebounded. Silicon Valley rose. Google, Apple, Amazon, names that would dominate the globe, grew from garages into empires. American influence wasn't just in embassies or aircraft carriers anymore. It was in smartphones, in streaming platforms, in artificial intelligence. It was cultural, invisible, addictive. And yet, challenges multiplied. China emerged as a rival not through war, but through trade, technology, and ambition. Russia reasserted itself through aggression. Global climate shifted. Pandemics swept across borders. American dominance no longer felt inevitable, felt negotiable. Inside the country, identity fractured. The idea of what it meant to be American grew contested. The melting pot boiled. Questions of race, history, privilege, and power resurfaced with force. Protest filled streets. Political divisions widened. Truth itself became a battleground. And yet, amidst the noise, America kept functioning. The Constitution, written over 2 centuries ago, continued to guide, constrain, and empower. Elections happened. Debates raged. Courts ruled. Innovation surged. Critics called it chaos. But it was also democracy in motion. The United States never promised peace. Promised freedom. And freedom, by nature, is messy. What makes America powerful is not just its military or its economy. It is its ability to absorb contradiction, to be hypocritical and visionary, broken and brilliant, violent and forgiving all at once. Contains multitudes, and it allows its people to question, to resist, to imagine better. No other nation has been so scrutinized, so loved, so hated, so imitated. From blue jeans to jazz, from the moon landing to memes, America's fingerprints are everywhere. And its story, however contested, remains central to the modern world. In the eyes of some, it is an empire in decline. In the eyes of others, it is a beacon still shining. Perhaps both are true. But if history has shown anything, it is that the United States is never finished. Every crisis it faces becomes a crucible for reinvention. Every failure becomes a chapter, not a full stop. From the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg to the code of Silicon Valley, from the cotton plantations of the South to the skyscrapers of Manhattan, America has evolved, often painfully, toward something bolder than a flag or anthem, toward a concept, a dangerous, beautiful, unfinished idea that ordinary people, governed not by kings or bloodlines, could shape their destiny. That is the core of its power. Not the size of its bombs, but the strength of its belief. That things can be better. That the dream is still alive. And though the world changes, though power rises in Beijing, Delhi, or elsewhere, the legacy of America's rise remains a reference point, a warning, and an inspiration. 200 years ago, it was a colony. Today, it's a titan. Tomorrow, that remains unwritten. The question is not whether America will lead. It is what kind of leader it chooses to be. And that, more than anything, will determine the next century, not just for the United States, but for us all.